Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I am here for my LCK 2023 Summer Split Primer and Power Rankings video. Really excited to get into this. As you guys know, these are my favorite videos to make across the entire year, previewing every single team in all of the regions that I cover, talking about all the players, where I would rank them. These are a blast to put together and to make, and I know you guys enjoy them as well. In this one, we're going to be talking about the LCK going into Summer Split. Not a ton of roster changes, especially compared to all the other regions, which did make quite a few changes, but the LCK definitely staying a little bit more consistent in the mid-year, but still some interesting things to talk about. So, if you are excited, let me know down in the comments section below. Of course, I'm going to be throwing out a lot of opinions in this video, and this is kind of the disclaimer for any conversations that want to happen in the comments section below. Everything that I say here is just my personal opinion. I'm going to be power ranking all of the teams as well as all of the players inside their own positions, but my rankings are not final. Again, they're just opinions. You know, if I rank a team at 10, realistically, I could see them moving up to number, 7 or 8 or something like that in a realistic setting. Of course, I'll also have tiers, and that's really where you can start to say, like, well, if they're in the same tier, then he probably thinks of them relatively similar, and you can think very similar things for the players. If I have a player ranked as the number 7 mid laner or whatever, they could realistically have a performance that could bring them close to top 3, top 4, or they could, flame out and be as bad as, like, bottom 2 in the region in terms of mid laners. All of that, I think, is a realistic possibility. These are just the orders that I'm going to go with at the beginning of the split, and so if you have any disagreements, of course, I'd love to hear you guys' thoughts down below, but let me know, if somebody's too high or too low, who you would put them above or who you would put them below. Obviously, it's all good and all to say that, this player deserves to be a top 3 or 4 player in their role, but if 6 players deserve to be a top 3 or 4 player in their role, again, not everybody's going to be able to get that, unfortunately. So let me know what you guys think down below, but with that out of the way, it's time to get into it. What we do here is go from number 10 to number 1 in my own personal power rankings, talking about every single team in the LCK, going over their strengths, weaknesses, their players, their play style, all that stuff, the upside, the downside, all that good shit. And so if you guys are excited, let's jump right into it. Of course, we're going to be starting off with number 10 in my power rankings, and kicking off number 10 is going to be the start of my D tier. The best way I can describe D tier, these are the 2 teams that I think are the least competitive. There are a bunch of tiers here in the LCK, more than, some of the other 10-team regions, because I do think that there are, kind of barriers between a couple of these teams, but, the bottom 2 teams I think are pretty clearly the bottom 2 teams. They have upside, because every team in the LCK has upside, but I don't necessarily expect, either of these bottom teams to be able to reach it. And coming in at the bottom of D tier for me, at the bottom of the LCK, and at number 10 in my power rankings, it is going to be Nongshim RedForce. I just don't really have a ton of confidence in this team. I don't think that, the one change that they made going into this next split is going to be enough to reverse the fortunes that were already kind of on the downswing coming out of the end of spring, and so I don't have a ton of confidence that this team is really going to be all that competitive. There are a couple of interesting players on this team that haven't necessarily shown things at the LCK level, but have shown things at smaller levels in the past, and so, I guess theoretically there is upside, but we'll talk about that when we get into the individual players. Let's go ahead and go over their roster. Their roster's looking like Din in the top lane, Sylvie in the jungle, Quad in the mid lane, Vital at AD carry, and Peter at support. Couple of interesting players on this team. Of course, some things that you'll notice, first of all, the power ranking, their record in spring, etc., but below each player, you're going to see a number. That's where I personally power rank them within their role in the LCK, and then in parentheses, you're going to see whether that has risen or fallen from my preseason predictions in spring. And so, a plus will mean that they rose, a minus will mean that they fell, and an equal sign will mean that they are in the exact same spot. Of course, if it says new, that means they're new to the league, and so they weren't ranked in spring. But let's go ahead and talk about the roster, starting with Din in the top lane. He's fine. I really don't even think he's that bad of a player. He can be a little bit feast or famine in the top lane, maybe more so than some of the other lower tier teams' top laners. I actually think top lane's a relatively deep role in the LCK, even if it isn't like crazy top heavy. There's only a couple of really, really good ones in the LCK, but I feel like the difference between, 5 and 6 and 9 and 10 really isn't that ginormous. But Din does come in at number 10 for me because I do think he had the most amount of questionable games games last split. Obviously still has upside. I know that there are a lot of people in the LCK and especially the Challengers League fandom that really like him as a player, but I've never really seen it. I talked about that in my spring predictions. He came in at number 10 in the spring, and it's going to be the same here. I just don't see a crazy amount of upside for him, and I certainly don't think he's going to be moving the needle for a team that isn't really all that good already, and so maybe you can play through him a little bit, but I wouldn't expect him to be a big game changer for this team. And then you've got Sylvie in the jungle. It's unfortunate that I have to move him down to number 10 here because I really liked him coming into the year. He was one of the players on this team that I thought had a good amount of upside. Remember, I had this team ranked 8th in my spring preseason power rankings because I actually thought the mid-jungle duo was going to do well. I was wrong about that. Mid-jungle was not doing well. They were the weakest mid-jungle in the league, very likely. I mean, there were a couple of teams that I think maybe had an argument to be in that conversation, but Nongshim was definitely in that conversation, and Sylvie was a big part of that. There were games where he was all right, but for the most part was just kind of getting out jungled, especially in the early game. I still think he has a lot of potential because I really liked what we saw out of him in the Challengers League, and I think as a player, he's incredibly talented. We know he can be a smart pather, a smart jungler who is able to generate early leads, but we just didn't see any of that in the LCK in his first split, or his first main split as the starter, I guess you could say. Obviously, he's going to get another chance here with a different mid laner, and hopefully you're hoping that that duo can be a little bit more explosive. That's probably the reason you're bringing Quad in the first place. We'll get to him in a bit, but you're hoping that Sylvie and Quad can be a little bit more aggressive in the early game. You know, that's something that Quad has done really well in the past with his junglers in particular, and so if you can unlock Sylvie a little bit, if you can get him to the potential that I saw in him at the beginning of the year, that's going to be a lot better for Nongshim, and that really, to me, is the avenue for this team to get better than 10th, is for this jungle position to start to improve. If you can get Sylvie into that position where, you know, he can be relatively a positive, I think that Nongshim's going to be in a better position to climb out of 10th, but until then, I just don't have a lot of... I can't put him any higher than number 10 in the jungle rankings based off of what he showed last split. And then you've got Quad coming into the mid lane. They're one new addition here. I believe Quad is going to be starting. They did sign him. They still have both Fiesta and Call Me on the roster. Theoretically, either of those two could also play, but I think Quad is their best option here. Longtime LCK fans will remember him as Solka back on DRX. He had that miracle run in spring. Not a miracle run, but a crazy split on that DRX team in spring of 2021, I believe it was. That was one of the teams that really got me into DRX as an organization, and it's good to see him back in the league. He really was never given a fair shot after that in any league really at all, and so Nongshim giving him a chance here I think is a really good idea. What he was known for and what that DRX team in general was known for back in the day was incredible aggression in the early game. They were willing to 50-50 a lot of plays early to try and generate a lead that they could snowball out of control, and Quad is a very aggressive mid laner. That's why I am a little bit excited about the potential fit between Sylvie and Quad here, because if you can get Sylvie active in the early game, if Quad wants to, you know, shove and roam and be really active on these skirmish plays in the early and mid game, that's going to help his jungle out a lot, and I think that could set them out in terms of early game leads a lot better than what they had in spring. That's really, again, the avenue where I think this team has the most potential to improve. They had Fiesta last split, and I was a big fan of Fiesta as well in the Challengers League, but he did not adapt well at all to the LCK. He was probably the worst mid laner in the LCK last split. And so to bring Quad in, I think it just gives you a little bit more upside. It certainly gives you more aggression, and I think that's going to be a positive overall. Again, if those two can develop a synergy, I think that's going to be huge. And then you have Vital and Peter as your bot lane. They're coming back here. A lot of people were super hyped on Vital going into the year. I didn't necessarily see it in the LJL. He was given some opportunities, and he was on some good teams, but I didn't think that he was like a game breaker, especially for the LCK, and that did prove to be relatively true, although I do think he was a little bit better than maybe I was giving him credit for. He's going to come in as my number 880 carry. He's probably the most consistent player on this team, and him and Peter are definitely the strong side of the map, or that's what they wanted to be in spring. I certainly think that they are the lane that's going to lose the least, and that's going to be a positive overall for Nongshim. But again, you know, maybe I'm going against the grain by saying this, but I just don't see a ridiculous amount of like insane upside for Vital on this team, especially because he's going to be relied upon to be this hyper carry, especially in the current meta, which is just, you know, go bot lane and you know, play Lucian or play Aphelios or play Zeri and just, or play Jinx and just win the lane through that, right? I'm not sure Vital is that kind of player. I think it would be more optimal for him to be more of a secondary carry on a team with like a really good mid laner or a really strong top side, but that's not what Nongshim have here, and so I worry a bit that if you invest a ton into him, that he's just not going to be the guy that's going to drag you out of 10th or 9th place, but he's a solid player. He can play in the LCK. I just don't think he's going to be a superstar. And then Peter has shown some really good things in the past. I remember last year for that miserable Nongshim team, he was kind of the shining light Light, when he was playing, the team was better, but him and Vital actually don't seem to have a ridiculous amount of chemistry together. I think they're both individually fine, but Peter's going to fall in terms of his ranking here. He's going to go all the way down to number 9 because I just don't think that his connection and his ability in lane has translated into 2023. Again, you look at players like Sylvie, you looked at Fiesta, you looked at Peter. I really liked a lot of those guys going into 2023, but none of them have really lived up to that expectation. I think all of them were significantly worse than I was hoping for. If you want to see some upside from this bot lane, I think if they can be really solid, if they can go even in almost any matchup in the league, in a league that has a lot of really, really good bot lanes, that's going to be positive overall. But I think if you're looking for upside to get out of top 10, maybe, you know, I'm not going to say this team can get to top 6 because I think that would be a pretty big stretch, but maybe get to top 7, top 8. I think that's going to be the mid-jungle duo. Again, that's really where I think that this team is going to have an opportunity to break out. If Sylvie can get back on track, if Quad can come back into the league and be a big positive, or even if it's Fiesta or Call Me and, you know, they figure something out, I think that could be good. If Din has more good games and less of just the bad games where he gets rolled over in lane, I think that's going to be good. And if you can find a lane to play for that isn't bot lane, so you can isolate that 2v2 and just allow them to scale into the late game, I think that's the kind of play style and, you know, mental that Nongshim should end up going for. But that's a lot of things that have to happen. Sylvie and Quad have to gel. Vital and Peter have to be good in the late game. Din has to not feed. These are just things that we haven't seen at the LCK level up until this point. And so just like Spring, I'm going to predict this team to finish in last. And then moving on to number 9 in my power rankings here. Again, I said the bottom 2 teams were going to be the 2 teams in my D tier, and that is true. So coming in at the top of my D tier, which just as a reminder are 2 teams that I just don't think are going to be all that competitive in the grand scheme of things. I would be very surprised if they ended up making top 6 and making playoffs, but I guess theoretically anything's possible in the LCK. But coming in at the top of my D tier and at number 9 in my power rankings, it is going to be OKSavingsBank BRION. And, you know, for the rest of this video and probably for the rest of this year, I'm just going to call them BRION. I'm not going to talk about OKSavingsBank. It's just too long. I'm sorry. It's a crazy long name. I get you need sponsors, but I'm not going to call them that. I'm going to call them BRION. So, BRION coming in here at number 9. This is just one of those teams that I think I can best describe as okay floor, but like no ceiling. Like the ceiling is the floor. I just don't really see a lot of upside for this team to be better than what they are. I don't think that there are a lot of players on this team that are going to outperform expectations, and especially making no changes in the midseason after, you know, just taking like such huge losses towards the back half of the year, I think is not and necessarily an encouraging sign, I would say, for what this team's performance in summer is going to look like. So let's go ahead and go over their roster. Their roster is looking like Morgan in the top lane, in the jungle, Karis in the mid lane, Henna at AD carry, and Effort at support. Of course, we're going to go roster member by roster member, and that means we get to start with Morgan in the top lane. Some people are going to be frustrated to see his ranking so low at number 9 here, but again, I think you could realistically put him anywhere between like 5 or 6 and 10. Like, all of those players are basically the same player. Morgan's going to have some games that he just wins for you, even at the LCK level. He's had a couple of really good ones, not only last split, but last year as well. I think he's a pretty decent player, especially when he gets the champions that he's good at. He's just not a game wrecker. He's not one of the top 3 to 4 top laners in the region, and that's okay. You don't have to be one of the top 3 to 4 top laners in the region. You can be just good, and I think Morgan is just good. Like I said, that position is relatively deep, but Morgan's going to have some games where he looks really, really good, especially on like Renekton or a lot of the other champions that I think he's relatively well known for. It's just the consistency is going to be a little bit of an issue, and that's just kind of the case for a lot of the top laners in this part of the LCK rankings. Is just you're not going to have a good game all the time, especially when the rest of the team doesn't necessarily play around you all the time. Ironically enough, I think he's probably the best carry on BRION, but I don't think that they're going to play for him all that regularly, or at least they haven't shown that they wanted to do that in spring. And I think when he doesn't get a ridiculous amount of resources, he's not someone who's going to just like completely take over the game in team fights or anything like that, even on a tank. So he's just fine. He's a good player, someone you're probably going to be happy to have, and someone who you absolutely can win with and can make playoffs with, but you're probably not going to make playoffs because of Morgan. And then you've got in the jungle. It looks like he's going to continue to play here over Raptor, which is fine. I think Umti's fine. He's like the prototypical meh LCK jungler. Like, he's not going to break the bank. He was really good in week 1 in spring, and then was just kind of, he returned to normalcy and just kind of meh over the course of the rest of the split. He's just fine. He's going to be better than the worst junglers in the league, which is why he comes in at number 8, but he doesn't really have the upside to be a top 6, top, 5 jungler in the league. He's just not going to be that. He's going to be someone who is going to beat up on players who are playing really poorly or not in form, but he's never really going to exploit good teams, and it's just what you get with him. I don't necessarily think that he's going to be a huge positive for a team that's going to be trying to climb its way out of bottom 2, and, I think that's okay. I think, this team has been looking for an upgrade in that jungle position for quite a while. They've just not found anybody that's going to be better than Umti, which is unfortunate because he's not really a game breaker, in my opinion, and he's not really someone who gives me a ton of confidence that this team is going to overperform expectations. And then you've got Karis in the mid lane, someone who, again, honestly, kind of similar to Morgan, will have games here or there that look really good, but unlike Morgan, I think his downside is much worse. I think that he has games where he's also just really bad, and he gets in cold stretches very, very easily. We've seen that both on Hanwha Life and now on BRION as well. I have him as the number 10 ranked mid laner. I think he's the worst mid laner in the LCK right now, at least starting mid laner. And I think that's a little bit of a problem. I think that there isn't a lot of, we've been kind of hoping for this upside from Karis. I was really a fan of his in the Challengers League 2 years ago, but he's just shown that he's not an LCK caliber mid, or at least he isn't at the current moment. And I don't see any reason for that to change this split. None of the surrounding core has changed. Umti's not the kind of player that's going to make his mid lane look a ton better, and so I expect Karis to continue to look like a bottom tier LCK mid laner, and I don't really see a lot changing from that. He'll still have good games, but again, over the course of an entire split, I just don't see a crazy amount of upside there. And then Hanwha and Effort, I think they're meh as a bot lane. There are a couple of bad bot lanes in the LCK right now. Not to say that, Hanwha and Effort are garbage. I think that they're above that. It's why Hanwha comes in as the number 7 ADC, because I think there are quite a few, really unproven AD carries at this level at the current moment, but I certainly don't think that they're a bot lane that you're going to want to play towards, and that's a little bit of an issue. Hanwha's, again, very similar to Karis, had good games, but he also has incredibly bad games. Sometimes when he loses harder than anybody else in the league, and I certainly don't think Effort is the kind of player, especially in the early game, that's going to be able to get him regular leads, and that's kind of what Hanwha needs, and so I'm not expecting this bot lane to really shine or break the bank, and that's just kind of the overall message for BRION. I wish I had a ton of, in-depth analysis on what this team is going to play like, but I think their best carry is Morgan in the top lane, and then Umti can, have some good games here or there. Hanwha can have some good games here or there. Karis can have some good games here or there, but I don't think that there are a lot of positives for this team. I think the way that I described them at the beginning is incredibly accurate. They're a team with a relatively decent floor. Morgan's a solid player. Umti's an LCK caliber player. Hanwha can play at this level. Effort's had a lot of time at this level. They have LCK players, but the upside and the ceiling for this team is just not that high. I really would be shocked if any of these players broke out in 2023. It's not what I said about Nongshim. I thought there were upside pieces. If that mid jungle can get together, if Vital can show that, he's good at this level, there are pieces on that team that can, explode and make this ranking a lot worse, but I just don't see that for BRION. I think best case scenario, they're 7th or 8th. And I certainly don't think that would be an easy 7th or 8th. I think that would be them overperforming their player talent. And so I just don't see a lot of upside for BRION. I don't see a lot of ways for them to overperform this ranking. And I think if I had to take a guess, especially with the form that they ended off in spring with, which was bottom 2 form, by far bottom 2 form, I just don't really see a reason to rank this team anywhere outside of the bottom tier in the league. And then moving on to number 8 in my power rankings here. This is going to be the end of the D tier and the start of the C tier. If D tier for me were teams that I think realistically probably just aren't going to make playoffs, even if everything goes right, they're probably at best top 7, top 8 teams. I think C tier are teams that in a perfect world could figure something out and end up towards the bottom half of top 6, but something that I think would require, teams above them to be a lot worse than what we're expecting and for things to click. These are teams that I'm not predicting to be in that top 6, teams that I'm not predicting to be playoff teams, but definitely have more of a chance to hit that break point than any of the 2 teams we've covered up until this point. So kicking off our C tier and coming in at number 8 in my power rankings, it is going to be DRX. They come in at number 8. This is one spot higher than what they were able to finish in spring, and honestly, this is where they ended my power rankings in spring. Obviously, if you would follow the channel, DRX, I'm not going to say started to figure things out, but looked a little bit better towards the back half of the split than anything they did at the beginning, and obviously BRION definitely a team that was falling in terms of their stock towards the back half of the split, but I think that will continue a little bit more going into summer. This lineup still has a lot of talent. It just didn't work at all. Like, these players did not mesh well together. Everybody on this team basically had the worst split of their professional careers, and they're only making one change that I really don't have a lot of confidence in, and so they do come in at number 8 in my power rankings, but their roster is looking like Rascal in the top lane, Kroko in the jungle, Fate in the mid lane, Paddock at AD carry, and Beryl at support. We're going to go ahead and talk about this roster. Obviously, there is, Juhan to talk about when we get to the jungle position. I will be mentioning him very slightly because I do think that he is at least worth noting on this DRX team. But let's start in the top lane with Rascal. Rascal has been a channel darling in the past, somebody who I've ranked up there amongst the best top laners in the world, basically against anybody. Points last year, I was definitely on that board when he was playing for KT Rolster. But coming over to DRX, he had what was easily the worst split of his professional career. I don't even think it's really all that debatable. There were many moments last split where he was the worst top laner in the league. I mean, he was just running it down in certain games, and I know a lot of people are still really high on Rascal, and I would like to still be really high on Rascal. He's a player who I've always enjoyed watching play. He is very good at his specific types of champions, but is certainly not consistent, and there really isn't a lot here for me to believe that he's just going to figure it out in summer. He didn't get better as the split went on. He stopped feeding, as hard, but, the middle half of the split, it felt like he was so mentally checked out for this team that he wasn't even really playing at all, and so hopefully you can get the better version of him, because he's been one of the premier top laners, not only in the LCK, but in the world in the past at his absolute best. But right now, he's just basically as out of form as you could possibly get, and I really don't see a lot of reason for that to change. He's still going to get some respect coming in at number 7, because he was not the number 7 best top laner in the region in spring, but talent obviously has to be taken into account at least a little bit here, and he's got plenty of talent, and so if he can just get somewhere in the middle of that, that's going to be around the 5, 6, 7 range in terms of top laners, which should be enough for the rest of this team to be able to do something, but that would require the rest of this team to actually go and do something, which, again, is still a major question mark. Your jungler here, I believe, is still going to be Kroko. They flirted with the idea of playing Juhan throughout the split, as this DRX team seems to always do, but they landed on Kroko. The coach, obviously, is a big fan of Kroko, was the one who discovered him in the first place, but this was somebody who was on my radar as, an ascending superstar jungler in the LCK before coming to DRX last split, and everything just fell apart. I mean, he was the worst player on this team. I think you could absolutely make that case. I shouldn't say that, because we'll get to Beryl in a bit, but Kroko was certainly in the conversation for the worst player on this team. He was not winning in the early game. He was not transitioning anything into the late game. He was not helping his laners out. Basically, again, everything that could have gone wrong for Kroko went wrong. Now, luckily, I do think he got better as the split went on when Juhan came in and played relatively okay for a couple of games, and then Kroko came back into the starting lineup. It felt like Kroko learned quite a bit sitting on the bench. I'm not sure if that's going to be entirely replicable for an entire split, but you're hoping that Kroko can get back to the form that he was in on Liiv SANDBOX, because truly, when you look at 2022 on Liiv SANDBOX, he was one of the more interesting junglers in the entire league. Remember, in 2021, he won Rookie of the Year over Owner, which was a massive surprise to a lot of people, but he deserved it. At the time, he was a better jungler, and so the upside is absolutely still there for a player like Kroko, and I understand why this team is so stubborn in wanting to play him, but hopefully you're just kind of hoping and praying that out of Kroko and out of Juhan, you're going to get at least one solid starting jungler on this roster. And then you've got Fate in the mid lane. I've always been lower on Fate than I think the consensus. He's a fine mid laner at his best. I thought he was good. He was definitely more of a supportive mid laner. You're going to think a lot of roaming champions, a lot of the Galio, a lot of the Twisted Fate. That's kind of the things that, even the Orianna, things that are a little bit more supportive, things that don't need to hyper carry out of the mid lane. That's kind of his play style. And I do think he plays that role well, but man, you're going to look really bad when you're not good in lane on a team that doesn't have a carry. And that's exactly what happened to Fate, is he looked really bad in spring. There were a lot of games where he just got blasted in the early laning phase because it's really not his strength as a player. He's not somebody who's ever been a great laner at the LCK level, and when he isn't really able to use a lot of the other tools at his disposal, he's not going to be able to take over games in any meaningful way. You're just hoping, again, with this top 3, I know I'm getting a little bit redundant, but it really is the case for all of them. You're really just hoping that Rascal, Kroko, and Fate can just figure out how to play together, because they're all talented enough to be able to make this work. Rascal can be a carry top laner. Kroko can be this hyper, supportive, hyper enabler, I guess, jungler for the rest of this team, and Fate can be moving around the map with him to try and make plays at advantages, at you know, mismatch numbers kind of thing. So I think that there are a lot of advantages to having these three as your top side, but man, did it just not work out when they played together in spring. If they can figure it out, there is upside here, but I can understand why the styles don't necessarily mesh as well as I think a lot of people would hope. And then we get into the new addition in this team, which is going to be Paddock in the bot lane. Now, I'm shocked. I'm genuinely shocked to see Paddock starting here, because truthfully, he's really mostly played in Tier 3 in Korea. He's not really been a Tier 2 superstar in the Challengers League. He's played a little bit in there, but they have a really good AD carry in Tier 2. They have Playata, who did come in and play a little bit for Dektum last split when Dektum got hurt. Obviously, Dektum not going to be playing this split because of that wrist injury, which, you know, absolutely fine. Again, if you're hurt, you know, take some time off, get better, and then come back next year. It's going to be fine. This team's probably not going to win even with you, but to bring Paddock in here to be your starting ADC is just a very surprising move for me, because I think Playata is a really, really, really good player, and I think him joining this team would actually give me a little bit of upside. But, you know, Paddock's fine. He's somebody who's been playing at the Tier 3 level, and he's been good at the Tier 3 level. They've got a lot of good AD carries in this system. I think it's just a little bit of missed opportunity, and making that jump from Tier 3 in Korea to Tier 1, like, that's a big jump, and he's gonna have to be able to make that very, very quickly. He's got a lot of veterans around him, basically exclusively veterans around him, that are going to be able to hopefully make that transition a little bit easier, but he's playing with a support who is very feast or famine, and was mostly famine over the course of the spring split, and mechanically speaking, while he's pretty good, like, he's a solid ADC, he's not something that I'm going to, like, freak out about. There are a lot of really good mechanical ADCs in the region, and so he comes in at number 10. He's got a lot to prove to me. If he comes in and, like, this is the worst bot lane in the league, I'm not going to be all that surprised. I think that is a very realistic possibility for these two, and that's again because I don't have a lot of faith in Beryl. Beryl is a player who I've been really out on for basically 2 years now. Even when he won the World Championship, I was a little bit out on him. He was much better at that tournament, but go back to 2022, watch the regular season. He was one of the most harmful players towards his team's winning chances in that regular season. And yes, he got better as the playoffs and Worlds went on, but I mean, every negative quality that you could say about Beryl was ramped up to 10 in the spring split in 2023. I think 7 is a ridiculously generous ranking for him, and that's basically only going off the fact that he's a former 2-time world champion and that he's won in the past. If you're just going off of what he has shown, he was the worst player in the LCK last split, and it wasn't particularly close. Actively losing games, wasting his money, walking up to get vision when you know you have no prio, and when you know the enemy's going to be there. Just these crazy lapses of judgment that just lose his team games. It was insane, the decision-making that Beryl was going through. Now, obviously, he still has his positives. When they're winning, he still looks like a pretty good support, but from behind, from a losing situation, Beryl might be the single worst support in the world. Like, it's just not a part of the game that he is very good at. He does not know how to play less aggressive, and it gives the enemy team so much in terms of advantages, and obviously, you're hoping that he can figure that out, but again, like I said, if there's a world where these two are the worst two bot laners in the region this split, I'm not going to be entirely surprised. But if Beryl can figure it out, if he can have a much better split, kind of get back to that Damwon regular season level of Beryl, and if Paddock can come in and be better than I'm expecting him to be, like, there is upside for this bot lane, and we already talked about there being upside for this top side, but man, so many things have to change from what they were in spring for this team to be relatively competitive. I think it's possible, but it's certainly not something I'm going to bet on. So they come in at the bottom of C tier for me, and at number 8 in the power rankings, which is just about as high as I can place them. And now moving on to number 7 in my power rankings. This is going to be the top of C tier and my final projected non-playoff team. That's how the LCK works. The top 6 end up making playoffs, and so my final non-projected playoff team coming in here, and again, top of C tier, teams that I'm not predicting to make the playoffs, but I guess theoretically have playoff upside if something were to go right, and if one of the top 6 teams were to go wrong. But coming in at the top of C tier, and at number 7 in my power rankings, it is going to be the Kwangdong Freecs. I have them coming in at number 7, the top of this tier of, like, lower tier teams, I would say. It very much feels like a top 6 and then a bottom 4 if you want to classify it like that. And I think Kwangdong does come in as the top team in that bottom 4, but I still don't think that they are at the point where I feel comfortable enough saying that they can contend for top 6, because I do still feel like there are a lot of question marks about this roster. There are a lot of positives, but questions indeed. Their lineup is looking like doo-doo in the top lane, Youngjae in the jungle, Bulldog in the mid lane, Taiyun at AD carry, and I believe it's going to be Moham starting most of the year at support. He ended up finishing off the year for KDF. And so I imagine he will end up starting in summer as well. He was the better player anyways. So let's go ahead and talk about the lineup. Of course, starting with Dudu in the top lane. He's a solid player. Honestly, I like him quite a bit. He's very similar in my eyes to a player like Morgan that we already talked about, where there are going to be games that he just wins. He's really talented and he can get leads, especially if the team wants to invest resources into him. He's more than happy to be able to pay them out, and he's more than solid on weak side, but he's not a superstar. He's not going to be able to dominate 1v1s against basically anybody in the region. There are some really good top-end talent here in the LCK, and it's relatively deep as well in that top lane position, but Dudu's just not, he's not a superstar, just a solid player, someone you're going to be really happy about having on the team. I would argue that he's this team's second best player. I think he certainly was this team's second best player across spring, and honestly, I thought his split last year on Hanwha Life was incredibly underrated as well. He's just a solid LCK top laner, and you don't really hear a lot of people talking about him in that way. I think he's more than capable of playing at this level, and I definitely think he's an asset towards this KDF team in that top lane position. We could see his stock continue to rise if he has another really solid split here in summer, because there's a couple of players above him that he was just better than in spring, but I could also relatively see him being around this position. You're kind of expecting a lot of bounce backs from some players that weren't necessarily hyper consistent in spring, and so Dudu ends up falling all the way down to number 8, but like I've said like 800 times in this video already, 5, 6 to like 9 or 10, it's all relatively in the same zone. If he's going to perform like a top 5 top laner, I'm not really going to be all that surprised, and I'm just going to predict him to be a little bit lower than some players that maybe are a little bit more mechanically talented than him, but his consistency, I think, is a lot higher than people give him credit for. And then you've got Gen.G in the jungle. He's okay. I had him ranked as the last ranked jungler going into the split. He's been better than that. He certainly hasn't been last ranked. I don't think he's necessarily broken out by any means. I think he's fine as a jungler. He can definitely be taken advantage of by the best junglers in the league, but that's kind of what you expect for a rookie on kind of a bottom tier team, or bottom tier org, no offense to the Freaks. He's just fine. He's not someone who's going to drag down this team, you know, a crazy amount, but I would argue that he's probably, I don't want to say a weak link, but one of the things that I'm least confident in when it comes to this team, a reason that this team isn't going to be able to make top 6 in my opinion, is because I just don't have a ton of faith that Gen.G is going to be this like fantastic jungler. I think he's got good chemistry with Bulldog, especially when he's super willing to give over resources, because Bulldog is this team's hyper carry, but I don't really think he's anything special as a player, so he comes in at number 9 for me. And then you do have Bulldog on this team, and that's going to be an asset for any team here. Now, this is a player that I'm willing to admit I was just a little bit wrong about. I had him way too low in my preseason power rankings. I didn't necessarily see him in that superstar light. A lot of other people did, and I was kind of going out on a limb saying, I'm not necessarily sure he's going to break out as a rookie as much as people want him to, but that just wasn't the case. He was the best player on this team by a considerable margin, and especially towards the back half of the split, he was winning games on his own in the LCK, which is just super impressive for a rookie mid laner to be able to do. He's going to jump all the way up to number 7. I think realistically, he could continue to go a lot higher than this in the mid lane rankings. There's just a lot of good mid laners in the region right now. I mean, you guys know we'll get to a lot of the top 6 mid laners when we get to the top 6 teams, but it's just really hard for me to put him above any of those players at the current moment. But he's more than solid, and honestly, he's got the upside and the potential to be a top 3, top 4 mid laner in the region. We definitely saw it in the first split, and so if he can continue to grow, if this team continues to want and desire to play around him and kind of enable him as the main carry, I think that's going to be the best thing that they can do. And honestly, Bulldog is the reason they're at number 7. It's the reason they're above 8, 9, and 10, is because he is the best player that we have talked about up until this point, in my opinion. And then you've got the bot lane, Taiyun and Moham. They're just fine. I think at the end of the year they got better, but for a majority of the split, they were the worst bot lane in the LCK, which is not particularly good. Taiyun comes in at 9 because I just don't trust Paddock on DRX, and Moham comes in at number 8 because when he got reinserted into the lineup at the end of the year, he was actually playing really well. I'm not necessarily sure that's going to translate out to an entire split, but it is worth noting that I think he was relatively consistent over the back half of the split. He's been someone who's not been very good at the LCK level pretty much every other time he's gotten a chance, whether that be at the beginning of the year last split or last year for this KDF team. But, you know, if he's going to play like he did towards the back half of the split, I think that's going to be a positive. I just don't have a lot of faith that a player like Taiyun is ever going to break out as like a good AD carry. This is what I was talking about, where like the bottom teams just don't have great AD carries in a meta where you kind of really need a great AD carry, and I think it really hurts the upside of what this team is going to be able to accomplish. I think Taiyun and Moham, again, very similar to DRX, are probably the weak link of this KDF team, and if they do end up getting held back, if they end up being lower than the 7th place ranking, I would bet to wager it's almost entirely due to this bot lane just not being able to hold up against LCK talent. Hopefully Moham can continue the stretch that he was on, at the end of last split, being able to be a positive force for this team, and you're hoping Taiyun is just better than the worst bot laner in the league. I think that would be a positive and an improvement over what he was last split, but there's really not a lot of confidence from me when it comes to the bot lane, and that's unfortunate because I do like the solo laners on this team, which I said, I think if they're going to win games, if they're going to be that 7th ranked team in the standings, I think a lot of it is going to be Bulldog winning games, getting hyper carried, or I'm sorry, getting fed in the mid lane, getting, I don't want to say funneled in the mid lane, but, having a lot of the resources put into him and allowing him to carry games because he's incredibly mechanically talented, that is certainly going to be a good win condition, but outside of that, I still really like Dudu in the top lane, and he can win you games from that side. It's just the ancillary pieces on this team that I don't have a ridiculous amount of confidence in. Youngjae is a player that I think is just fine at this level. He's not going to be a superstar in my opinion, and then Taiyun and Moham could actually be a problem for this team if things don't go their way, and so some good and some bad, maybe more so than any of the teams that we've talked about up until this point, but when you have an incredibly talented potential rising star in the mid lane in the LCK, you're probably going to at the very least be relatively competitive. And now we get to move into the top 6 teams here in my power rankings. Remember, top 6 do make playoffs here in the LCK, and so we're finishing off my C tier, and we are entering my B tier. We've got a couple more tiers to go. Usually, again, not 5 tiers in a 10-team league, but we do have that here, and B tier for me are going to be the low-end playoff teams. Teams that realistically expect to be making playoffs, but I think are a little bit of underdogs, I would say, to make the World Championships. Of course, top 4 coming out of Summer Split, or I guess top 2 coming out of Summer Split, and then the 2 teams to come out of the Gauntlet are the teams to go to Worlds from the LCK. And so there definitely is an opportunity for, these 6 teams to be able to get their championship points enough and to be able to make a run. But the teams in the B tier are the teams that I'm not really expecting to be able to make that run, the teams on the outskirts. And coming in at the bottom of B tier and at number 6 in my power rankings, it is going to be Liiv SANDBOX. I have them coming in at number 6. They were clearly the 6th best team in the league last split. They were worse than the top 5, and they were clearly better than the bottom 4, and I think they're going to fill a very similar role here, although I do think they did improve their roster. I think when you're looking around at the league, of the teams that made roster changes, theirs is probably going to be the most immediately impactful of anybody. I actually really like the addition of Teddy, and we'll talk about that in a minute. It's going to give them a much better shot to be able to compete with some of those teams near number 4 and number 5, but for me, they're still going to have to come in at number 6 overall. So their lineup is looking like Bertle in the top lane, Willer in the jungle, Closer in the mid lane, Teddy at AD carry, and Kale at support. A lot of really good players here. I mean, there really is nothing else to say other than this team is talented. It may not be one of the most talented teams in the world, which is unfortunately what you need to be in order to compete at the top in the LCK, but it still is one super interesting team. So let's go ahead and go over the members, starting with Bertle in the top lane. I really didn't know what we were going to get out of Bertle in the LCK when he joined SANDBOX at the beginning of the year, but all of my expectations were blown away by his performances in spring. Everybody knows who followed the channel, who followed my content in spring, that I thought Bertle was criminally underrated by the community coming out of the spring split. I thought he was easily a top 2 or top 3 top laner in the region in spring, and that's a pretty impressive thing to say for a team that didn't necessarily play all that much through him, especially towards the back half of the split. But for the first 4 or 5 weeks of the split, I don't know if you could say outside of Zeus that there was a more impressive top laner with the leads that he was able to generate than Bertle. He was awesome and he fit into this team incredibly well. I expect his, his stock to only to rise over the next few weeks. I think he will continue to be a really, really good player, and I really don't have a lot of worries about him. Everything that Damwon saw in him for so many years and kind of forced down, even if he didn't work on that roster, definitely is showing up now. An incredibly talented player that I am very high on here on SANDBOX. And the same thing can be said for Willer. The one thing that I have to say about Willer is that watching him this past split, just in general, it really brings to light Hanwha life as an organization and just how misguided they were last year in general. I don't know if they were losing on purpose, but they had this guy on their roster and they weren't playing him for On Fleek, who is not very good, and he immediately leaves that after, making Worlds with the team the year before. He immediately leaves that Hanwha Life team to come over here to SANDBOX, and he's one of the most interesting junglers in the league. SANDBOX just does this every single split. They take players who are solid and they really get the best out of them. You've got to give a lot of credit to this organization, but Willer kind of joins that. He was arguably a top 3-ish jungler in the league last split as well. Not nearly as, in my opinion, dominant as a player like Bertle. Like, his wins weren't as flashy as Bertle's were, but I think you could argue that his were significantly more consistent, and I think that's what you're going to get with him. Just a really solid jungler, somebody who's going to be a positive force for this team, and somebody who they can play through both early and late. He's much more of a supportive style jungler, which I think helps this team out a lot, because you look at all the lanes, and it's a lot of carries. Bertle wants to carry, Closer wants to carry, Kale definitely wants to be a part of the action, and so Willer being somebody who's willing to give up resources, especially in the early to mid game, I think is definitely a positive overall for this team, and I think the 2 additions on the top side of the map were actually huge for them, and arguably 2 of the better players on the team with Bertle and Willer. And then you've got Closer in the mid lane. Now, I will admit, Closer's growing on me as a player. I certainly think that he was a lot better in spring than he had been in years past. I'd been a lot lower on Closer as a player over the course of his whole career. I thought he was just fine, like a decent player, a mid-tier mid laner in the LCK. I think a lot of people saw more upside from him than that, but I never really did. I thought his inconsistency was just way too high for me to consider him in that role, because the top tier of mid laners in this region are just really, really consistent, and he's not. He sometimes can just go on stretches where he's not very good, especially when he gets behind in the early game. But when he wins, when he's given resources, especially when his jungle is playing for him, he can really capitalize, and he can make a lot of waves here in the LCK. I thought he was pretty good in spring. Certainly not a superstar in my opinion. Somebody who does definitely have flaws, but I think for the most part is definitely a positive on this team. I think you can make an argument that he's maybe the least consistent mid laner of anybody in the top 6, which is why he comes in at number 6 in terms of those rankings, but I still think his upside is pretty solid, and game to game, he's going to have some really good games, and so I definitely don't want to discount him. I just think he's maybe a little bit more inconsistent than people give him credit for. And then you've got Teddy and Kale down in the bot lane. Of course, Kale has been kind of like the ADC whisperer over the past year or so. Obviously had Prince last year, and Prince is a great player. I'm not trying to say that Kale made Prince, but Kale certainly made Prince better, because then we see Envy come in, and Envy was somebody who had just never really gotten it together. He had never really looked good at the LCK level, and even towards the back half of last split he didn't, but Kale at the beginning of that split was making him look like $1 million, and really they have a superstar in the support position. I know he's only coming in as the number 5 support, but there are 5 legit world-class supports in the LCK, and I think you could put them in almost any order. If you wanted to put Kale as high as like number 2 or 3 in the region, like, I totally understand that what he has been able to do with basically anybody who comes in on this sandbox team has been commendable, and I think that will continue as we continue on in his career. I think he's a great player and definitely someone who I am very, very, very high on, and if you are not aware of him, you should be aware of him by now. And then Teddy in the bot lane, their new addition to this team. He's going to be replacing Envy in that role, and to me, this is a pretty big upgrade, and I think he fits stylistically with exactly what Sandbox want to do. I was talking about this a bit earlier. Willer, more of a supportive, kind of, secondary carry, initiative kind of jungler, and then you've got Bertle and Closer, who are very resource-heavy solo laners, and you want to bring in somebody in the bot lane who isn't going to need a crazy amount of assistance, and that's what Teddy is. He's arguably one of the more premier weak-side bot laners in the world. Now, it's not exactly the best meta to be playing weak-side bot, but Teddy can carry. We know he can scale into the late game. He's a great team fighter. It's just the early laning phase that hasn't necessarily been super consistent for him throughout the course of his career, but he's a great player, and Kale is a great laner, and so I could definitely see a world in which these two click and maybe are a little bit more consistent than people expect, but I feel like Sandbox's identity is going to be building around the fact that Teddy can honestly be left on an island, and he's still going to be a good team fighter in the back half of games. You can have Kale moving around the map, and then either Bertle or Closer is going to be getting a lot of attention, and they're going to be kind of set forward and really accelerated to try to get Sandbox a really big presence in that way. I think that's a really good idea for how they might want to play the game, and I think bringing Teddy in just gives you so much more security in that. He's basically just a better version of what they've had over the course of this year, so I could honestly see a world in which this team ends up being better than number 6. Like, the top 5 are incredibly talented, and they have a lot of star power that this team just doesn't necessarily have, but in terms of cohesion and in terms of, consistency, like, this team's right there. If you get a really good split out of Closer, and if Bertle continues to grow, if Willer has another great season in the jungle, and if Teddy and Kale have nice chemistry, especially if Teddy's going to be able to survive both with and without resources, like, this could be one of the sneaky, most interesting teams in the entire league. We could be seeing them, surprise people, kind of like last year's Liiv SANDBOX and go into the playoffs in, like, 3rd place or something like that. I'm not going to predict it because, again, the top 5 teams in this league are just ridiculously talented, but this was a good team that got got better in the offseason, and they really do have more upside, I think, than people are giving them credit for. Moving on to number 5 in my power rankings then. A lot of people see the LCK as a region with a top 5. And I think that was kind of the case and definitely true in spring. We're going to have to see if that ends up translating into summer as well. In my personal opinion, I think it's more of a top 4 than it is a top 5, and I'll explain that in just a second, because coming in at number 5 in my power rankings and still within the B tier, the same tier as the number 6 team, I have Hanwha Liiv Esports. I have this team coming in at number 5, even though they did win a playoff series in spring. They were able to take down Dplus KIA, move on to that double elimination bracket. They weren't able to win a series from there, but at the end of the day, still, you know, getting 4th place is a pretty big accomplishment for a team that at points in the split looked absolutely miserable. Looked like they couldn't win a game if their life depended on it, and there still are some pretty major questions in terms of what this team's going to be able to output, especially compared to some of the other teams here in the top 6, but we'll go ahead and get into that as we cover the roster. Their roster is looking like Kingen in the top lane, Klid in the jungle, Zeka in the mid lane, Viper at AD carry, and Liiv at support. It's the same roster they had in spring. Every team from this point onwards will have the same roster that they had in spring. Nobody at this point wants to make any sort of drastic changes. These are all world-class teams if you can figure out how to make them work. There's not really major upgrades to have in this offseason. But let's go ahead and talk about Hanwha. Let's talk about the strengths and the weaknesses, of course. This was a crazy inconsistent team across the regular season that was miraculously able to win a best of 5. And, you know, I'm not exactly sure if that's going to translate into future success. We'll go ahead and talk about why I don't necessarily believe in this team as much, but starting, of course, we have to start with Kingen in the top lane, and Kingen's fine. He's exactly who we thought he was. He's going to drop a little bit in rankings just because I think a couple of the other top laners honestly impressed me quite a bit. Bertle obviously being the main one that ends up jumping him, but he's still exactly who we thought he was. He can be a pretty decent weak side top laner. He can be given resources and he can do relatively well with them, but he's not a superstar. He's not the player that, you know, you got in World Finals when Aatrox was super overpowered that is just going to be able to carry a series. That's just not who he's going to be over the course of an entire split, and certainly over the course of a playoff series, which is fine. You don't need a superstar top laner in order to take over the game, but I think he's the weakest top laner in the top 6, and I think he certainly has the least amount of potential to carry games. That's, again, not to say he's a bad player. I just think there are a lot of good top laners in the region, and Kingen is just one of them. He's not better than every other top laner that we've covered on the list so far by a considerable amount. He's just solid, and I think that definitely holds them back as compared to the top 4 teams in the league. But really where you're going to see a lot of the questions for this team, especially when it comes to their performance in spring, is going to be out of the jungle position of which Klid occupies. And man, I try to be a Klid defender as much as I can because at the end of the day, like, he does have some really good games. And honestly, Hanwha Liiv won a lot of games because of Klid this past split, but almost every single game that they lost was also because of Klid. He's just that kind of player where the entire game really predicates on whether or not he's having a good day or not. He was great in that series against Dplus KIA. He heavily outplayed Canyon, and they were able to take that series relatively easily because of him. But man, the amount of games in the regular season that he just insta-lost, and the amount of series, honestly, that he just insta-lost because he was just way too aggressive, and he got super far behind in farm, and he wasn't playing for his laners. It was actually ridiculous. He's a very good carry jungler. He's someone who, if you do invest resources into him, he can actually output quite a bit for your team. But if he gets behind, he is going to single-handedly try to lose you the game. Very feast or famine, and honestly, one of the players I am most scared of in this top 6. There are times where he's going to look great and times where he's going to look awful. I still think there are more good times than people give him credit for, but I have to take into account the fact that a lot of times it is just really bad. I know he's got a bad reputation in the community, and honestly, it is relatively deserved for what happened last split. I still think that maybe he can turn it around, hopefully get a little bit more consistent, but it's never really been his style, especially in the past few years. He's been someone who has liked to risk the game, has liked to be the hero or the villain for his own team, and I don't really expect that to change too much. The unfortunate thing is you've got so much talent on this team that actively can win you games by themselves that it really doesn't have to be Klid doing that, and it's unfortunate that he feels like it has to be him. If he can learn to take a little bit more of a backseat role, at least allow some of his laners to be able to win the game for him, I think he's going to be in a better spot. But until he proves that he can do that, I'm going to rank him relatively low. He could be lower in these rankings, but this is where he's going to end up. And then you've got Zeka in the mid lane. Everybody knows I'm a huge fan of Zeka. He is like the channel darling. We always talk about my channel darlings. I think it started started with Zeka, and he's the one that I think my channel, it's almost the poster boy of my channel, if you will, and so of course, I have to be relatively high on him, but he is also still inconsistent. He's a great player, and honestly, his highs are as good as anybody else's in the entire world. I've been saying that for years, and I think his consistency is honestly a little bit underrated. You go and look at his statistics from the last split. He led all mid laners in basically every single category. He is a beast in lane, arguably the best laner of all the mid laners in the region. The problem is that sometimes he's just not going to have the biggest impact on the game in the mid game, and that can be a little bit of an issue. Obviously, you know, you talk about other great laners that don't necessarily move around as much. Chovy, Knight, those kind of players come to mind, but they are significantly more active, I would say, than what Zeka was over the past split. I think if you do invest a lot into him as a player, he can carry you. He can actively win you games. We saw that so much at the World Championships last year, but Klid's not the type of jungler to have that playstyle. I think that was a big reason why Zeka didn't look as good, is I don't think Klid and Zeka's playstyles match up particularly well. Klid wants resources, Zeka wants resources. Zeka was the one to take a back seat in spring. It's probably going to be similar in summer. I just think that is actively not maximizing what you have at your disposal in terms of the mid lane. Zeka is a ridiculously good player, and it just doesn't feel like he's ever going to get the opportunity to be that for Hanwha Life, even if I still think he's great, and I think he was underrated last split. And then you've got Viper and Life in the bot lane. Kind of a tale of two players here. Viper is still going to rank as my #1 AD carry in the entire region. He is what saves Hanwha Life from falling down to number 6 in my power rankings, what with Liiv SANDBOX getting better. Viper is still just an absolute menace, and he showed it over the second half of the split. Even if I do think that his achievements were a little bit hyped up, a little bit more than maybe, I'm not going to say they deserved, but like he wasn't like guaranteed first team all-pro levels of bot lane. I still think the talent was definitely there, and I think if he has a team that's willing to play around him a bit more, it's going to be better. He is also someone who has gotten super used to getting resources over the course of his career, and honestly, this is really, like, you can say what you want about Zeka not getting resources and having to play a little bit more of a secondary carry style, but, you know, where Klid's, I don't want to say selfishness, because that's not the word that you should be using, but where Klid's resource heaviness comes into effect the most is Viper actually losing out on quite a bit of resources, which is just never what you want to do. If you were to invest everything into Viper, I think this team would be a top 3 or a top 4 team in the region. He is that good, and the rest of the ancillary pieces on this team are that good, but if you're just kind of making him be a guy that has to get his own leads in 2v2s and then is about as strong as the enemy AD carry and is never going to be like super invested in, then you're probably not going to be better than this #5 ranking. Viper is ridiculously talented, but there's only so much that he's going to be able to do. If this team has a sudden drastic change in terms of how they want to approach the game, then I think that Viper could be the kind of player that carries them over the top, but I just don't really see that being a huge probability, I guess you could say, for Hanwha. And then Life in the support position, he had a very shockingly bad split in spring. I was expecting him to actually be really good for this team. He's been really good over the course of his entire career, basically for everybody that he's played for, but he was pretty miserable in spring, just constantly out of position, really bad in the laning phase, which is just something that he was never before, and so very, very weird stuff from him. You have to hope that it was just an outlier and that playing with Viper for longer than a couple of months is going to develop some sort of synergy between the two, but if he continues to be a lower tier support in this region, then Viper's ability to carry games out of the 2v2 is also going to be diminished, and it's really going to make his job significantly harder. And so I think there's a ridiculous amount of talent on this team. Zeka and Viper are two of the scariest like carry duos in the league. I think that there is an opportunity for those two to absolutely take over games as long as their teammates get out of the way. Kingan's fine. I don't really have a major issue with him, but Klid got in the way a lot. He needed to be the hero or the villain. If he can kind of find a middle ground there, I think that's going to be great for them, and Life just needs to get back to the form that he's played out basically for the entirety of his career. If both of those things happen, Hanwha could be a Worlds team, and it wouldn't even really be all that surprising. We all kind of expected that going into the year, but with everything they've shown so far, with how they like to play the game, and the resources that they're willing to give to their superstar carries, it's just hard for me to believe that this team is going to outpace other teams above them in the standings that just play the game with a little bit more focus. And then moving on to the top 4 here in my power rankings. These are the teams that I predict will be going to the World Championship from the LCK here in the summer split. The 4 best teams in the region, and that means we're finishing off our B tier and we are starting our A tier too. Still 2 more tiers left to go, which is pretty insane to say considering there's only 4 teams left and we're already at A tier, but that's really what the LCK offers, is a ridiculous amount of success, and let me tell you, there's going to be a tier above A tier, but kicking off A tier, what essentially it is teams that I expect to be going to the World Championship, but maybe not quite enough to be able to dominate the world quite like the best teams in the LCK always have a pretty decent shot to be able to do. Still, incredibly talented teams, some of the most dangerous in the entire world, but maybe not the elite, like, best of the best. And so, coming in for me at number 4, and at the bottom of the A tier, it is going to be Dplus KIA. DK coming in here at number 4. This is about the best place I probably could have put them. They are the team that ended up going down to Hanwha Life in 5th place in the spring split, not winning a playoff series, which was definitely a little bit disappointing, not only for this roster, but for this organization, which is the single worst finish they've ever had. It's insane how successful Damwon has been ever since entering the LCK, but, you know, being in 5th place, if that's the worst you've ever done, that's pretty damn good, and this roster still has a lot of things to like about it. I honestly think spring was probably worst case scenario for how this roster ends up turning out, and even then they were still incredibly competitive throughout most of the split. They ended up, I think, finishing in 3rd, or maybe it was 4th in the regular season, and unfortunately they weren't able to get over that best of 5 hump, but a lot of reasons to believe that they're going to be able to change that as we get into summer. So let's go ahead and go over it. Their roster is looking like Kana in the top lane, Canyon in the jungle, Showmaker in the mid lane, Deft at AD carry, and Kellen at support. It's just world-class players, essentially across the board, all of which have pretty incredible experience at this level as well. So let's go ahead and talk about it, starting, of course, with Kana in the top lane. If there is a quote-unquote weak link of the team, I guess it's Kana. He's just the least proven member of this roster. Somebody who had a pretty rough 2022 on that Nongshim team that just never clicked, but is now on, you know, Dplus, an organization and a roster that has pretty consistently done well. And he looked good for a majority of the split. Now, he's a little bit more inconsistent than the best top laners in the region, which is why he comes in at number 4 for me, but even 4 is certainly not bad. He's got the potential to be better than this. We've seen him be better than this at the LCK level in the past for different teams, but there's just a little bit about him. He'll have some really good weeks. There were some games where he completely popped off for Dplus, dominating in lane, being super effective in team fights. Even if he wasn't given a lot of resources, he was just very efficient with a lot of what he was doing. And then there were also other games where he was a complete non-factor, or he was just losing hard in lane. It's the inconsistency that keeps me from putting him any higher in this ranking. But really, I mean, he's got the talent to hang with anybody in the top lane. There are going to be weeks where he's the number 1 top laner in the LCK, just like he was in spring for a little bit. It's just, week to week, I'm not expecting him to be able to maintain that for an entire split. Then you've got Canyon in the jungle, and some people are going to look at the number 3 ranking and say that's too low. And this is exactly what happens every single year with Canyon. I don't know how to tell you guys. This is exact same thing happened in 2022. Go back and watch a lot of those videos if you do not believe me. Canyon had a really rough 2022 in terms of the regular split. It didn't really feel like he was this elite player, but when the games mattered the most, when it, you know, came to them qualifying for the World Championships and then them playing at the World Championships, he was more than capable of being able to keep up with everybody. It's just what happens with Canyon. He saves his best stuff for the biggest games, and I still believe that's going to happen. However, there are 2 junglers in the league right now that I would be remiss just to not rank above him. He can be number 1, and there are going to be times where he is number 1 on this list, but there are 3 world-class elite junglers in this league, and unfortunately, Canyon's just in the worst form of all 3 of them right now. So he comes in at number 3, but he's still an asset to this team. You're kind of hoping that he isn't the spring version. I was actually really defending Canyon last year when he was getting a lot of flack from LCK fans. You can go check out a lot of the videos I posted last year for that, but it honestly feels like the opposite. I feel less encouraged this year with what we've seen out of him in spring. Obviously, I still have a ton of faith that he's going to be able to turn it around and that it's not really going to be a huge problem, but his spring was certainly not the best split of his entire career. In fact, I think you could argue it was one of his worst, and so definitely something to keep in mind, but it's Canyon. I can only rank him so low. And same thing for Showmaker. It was a little bit different for Showmaker because he really was kind of feast or famine over the course of the regular season. Through the first 4 weeks or so, I would say, the regular split in spring, he was bad. He just wasn't very good for this team at all. He was consistently losing lane, didn't really have a lot of pressure. He honestly just didn't look all that motivated in the mid lane, and I'm not really sure that was something that I thought was going to be fixable. However, the second half of the split, you could make an argument that at least in the second half of the regular season, he was the best player in the LCK. The dude dominated over the second half, wasn't able to translate that into the playoffs, but he really found his form as the season was coming to a close and was absolutely dominating even some of the best players in the entire league. I remember a game specifically against Chovy where he just absolutely brutalized him in lane, and that does not happen to Chovy very often. That's the kind of form that Showmaker was in at the end of the split. And so 3, again, seems maybe high for some people. Some people are going to put players like Zeka, or, you know, we'll get to BDD in a bit. Some people are going to put those players ahead of Showmaker. I just don't have the confidence to do that at the current moment. Showmaker absolutely still has it in him to be one of the best mid laners in the world. As we saw through the second half of last split, it's just about getting that best version of him throughout the entire season, rather than just in a select few couple of weeks towards the back half. If Canyon and Showmaker can be their, you know, good versions of themselves, or at least, you know, better than what they were in spring, then I think this team has a case to be made to be top 2, top 3 in the entire region. But, you know, those are some ifs, and honestly, I'm not really expecting them to be in the regular season. I'm expecting them to be better than what they were in spring, but maybe not by a ridiculous amount. So much so that I think they're elite, maybe just not the top of the top in the region, and that's enough to keep them down here at 4. And then the bot lane was also incredibly good. Honestly, this was the most consistent part of Dplus KIA over the course of spring. Deft and Kellen actually meshed really well together. Deft is someone who I've actually been kind of lower on, I think, than public opinion over the course of his entire career. Not that I don't think he's legendary, not that I don't think he's one of the top, you know, 2 to 3 AD carries of all time, but I think in terms of his recent success especially, he's been more of a secondary carry on a lot of these teams. He hasn't necessarily been asked to be this big hyper carry in the bot lane. He wasn't that for DRX last year, and he certainly hadn't been that in recent years either. And so, you know, I didn't think of him as like the super big hyper carry that maybe some other people did, but he actually kind of changed that opinion for me a little bit in spring, where he was really dominant with a lot of resources. This team invested a lot into him, especially in the early game, and he definitely paid it back out. And so I feel pretty good about Deft, mostly because he also has Kellen down there in the bot lane, and Kellen is a world-class player. He is an elite level support, and he's not going to get the credit for it. Maybe he is at this point. People really saw how good he was throughout the spring split, but he's been this good for a while, and people have just not really been talking about it. Kellen's awesome. He does every single part of the game well. He's a great laner. He knows exactly when he needs to roam. His vision is fantastic, and he's a fantastic team fighter as well. He's a great shot caller and a macro presence. There really is no weakness to his game. If the best player in the world wasn't a support right now, Kellen would very likely be the best support in the LCK. Unfortunately, he's got to go up against KT, and that's a pretty difficult thing to go up against, so he comes in number 2 in terms of the rankings, but Deft and Kellen as a bot lane are a huge positive for this team, and another big reason why I feel so much confidence that the 5th place finish and the lack of winning a playoff series in spring was definitely more of an outlier than something I would expect to happen again here in the summer split. And so, as for Dplus overall, a lot of positives, a lot of good things for this team. I'm really confident that the bot lane is going to be fine, but if you can get the best versions out of Canyon and Showmaker, this ranking could go up a significant amount. I mean, they could be a top 2, top 3 team. Hell, they could theoretically win the LCK. Like, they are good enough in terms of talent to at least be in the conversation for that. We were saying that at the beginning of the year. It absolutely stands true here. It's just going to be about consistency. Can Kana go up against some of the best top laners in the world consistently and win? Can Canyon and Showmaker get back that form and that synergy that made them the best duo of all time a couple of years ago? And then can Deft and Kellen even take that next step and be one of the elite bot lanes and not just one of the great bot lanes here in the LCK? All of these things are possible, but for now, they're going to come in at number 4 because I think the 3 teams above them are just a little bit more proven in terms of what they showed in spring. But again, upside for DK, about as high as you could possibly get. Now we are finally jumping into my top 3 teams here in the LCK. Only 3 remain, and it is the top 3 teams from spring placements, and I really think a lot of that is just because not a lot has changed in terms of the rosters in this league, but also I think a lot of the strides and adjustments made by the teams that did end up making top 3 were very sustainable and things that I could expect to see continue on into the future. So let's go ahead and go over it. For me, coming in at number 3 in my power rankings and at the top of that A tier, just outside those best teams in the world conversation, one that, you know, maybe by the end of this split, we could be talking about them getting into. I have KT Rolster coming in at number 3, and man, KT Rolster fans are going to be excited about this. I know I've got a ton of you guys down in my comments section that watch the videos. Really appreciate you guys. You guys are always awesome every single year, but this is the first year where I've really believed in this team as much as the fans do. There's a lot to like about what this team did in spring and the strides that they were able to make with a lot of the players that they brought in, and I really do think that it's entirely sustainable. Right now, they're looking like a Worlds team, and that is about as good as I can say about KT Rolster, something that has not been able to be said about the organization in the past few years. So let's go ahead and talk about this roster. Their roster is looking like Keen in the top lane, Cuz in the jungle, BDD in the mid lane aiming at AD carry, and Lehens at support. I mean, this is a really good roster, but on paper, you might be looking at this and wondering why they're not below Dplus KIA. Why, maybe numbers-wise, it doesn't add up. And I do understand where you guys are coming from, but there are a lot of reasons to say that this team might actually be more consistent than a team like Dplus, which is crazy to say about KT Rolster as a team of all things, but really, I do have a lot of faith that this team's floor is incredibly high, which is why they come in at number 3. We got to start with Keen in the top lane, and he might just be their single best player. He is one of the few top laners in the world right now that I would genuinely describe as elite. There aren't really a lot, and there haven't been over the course of the last few years, and I was worried that Keen had kind of fallen out of that conversation over the past year or so, because 2022 wasn't all that great. It definitely felt like he was on a downward trajectory on a team that wasn't really all that competitive in KDF last year. Obviously, this dude's been an elite level top laner for many years in the past. I'd had him ranked at number 1 going into 2022. Unfortunately, he didn't really live up to that billing, and so I did have him ranked, I believe, at 3 or 4 going into this year, something significantly lower, but it is so good to see the fact that if you surround Keen with talent, and if you give him a team that he can feel motivated in, that he still is that guy, that you can still give him resources and he can straight up win you games. He comes in as my number 2 top laner in the region, and he really is someone that you have to watch out for every single time that you're playing against KT. Because as deep as the top lane pool here is in the LCK, Keen will obliterate you if you leave him in an isolated 1v1. He is so good in lane, and he really never loses that you have to at least give him a little bit of attention, and it opens up the map so much for the rest of this roster. We saw it a lot, not only towards the back half of the regular season, but especially when we got into best of 5s, where Keen just became an absolute monster for this team. He is a great player and someone that I'm sure KT fans are happy to have. In my opinion, he is the best player on this team. I think he's the most talented at the very least. We'll get into some of the other players that are going to make some big impacts, but Keen is elite. And then you've got Cuz in the jungle, another player that I've been lower on over the course of his career. I've always thought he was a fine jungler, somebody who is definitely good enough to win with in the LCK, which is certainly not an understatement. You've got to be pretty damn good to be able to win in the LCK, but I didn't think he was some game takeover kind of player. Well, he was really good in spring, and I'm hoping he's going to be able to keep that up. A lot of people have been telling me that I've been low on Cuz for years. It's been a pretty common theme in my comment section, and so to see a split where it really felt like he put it all together in my eyes, I think is a really good sign for me. He's going to jump up to the number 4 jungler in the region. Top 3 is just a little bit rich for me. All 3 of those guys are like the best in the world, and so a little bit difficult to break into that conversation, but Cuz is more than good enough to be in the conversation at the very least, and definitely is the best of the rest at the current moment. He is a really good jungler, someone who you absolutely can win because, and again, we were talking about playoff performances. As good as Keen was, Cuz was also fantastic in terms of their best of 5s in spring, and so those are the 2 players you're really looking at, hoping that they can continue off from where they were in spring. And then you've got BDD, again, another player who just rebounded so well at the beginning of this year. Talk about a disaster year last year on Nongshim, everything going wrong for that entire organization, all of those players getting sick, none of them really recovering all that well, and, everything just kind of falling apart. You never really know what you're going to get from players after seasons like that, but BDD coming to KT Rolster was legitimately an MVP candidate for last split, and, having him at number 4 does feel kind of disrespectful, but again, top 3 are just so locked in terms of, LCK talent that it's hard to place him in there, but he will perform just as well as those guys will. It's just individually, I don't know if I trust him on the same level. He's right there in terms of skill though. So I don't know. Maybe he is top 3. I think that's going to be up to you guys to decide, but he comes in at number 4 for me, and I really like him. Again, breakout split again in 2023, as if he hasn't had 7 of those in his career up until this point, but it's just good to see him be, Gen.G BDD again and not Nongshim BDD. It's good to see him kind of adapt to the team well. Also worth noting, Cuz and BDD play fantastic together. They are one of the most in-sync jungle mid duos in the world at the current moment, and that's going to really push them forward. That's another big plus in their category. But BDD, Cuz, Keen, all playing fantastic after what most people would consider rough 2022s for their standards. And then you've got the bot lane of Aiming and Lehens. I feel like I'm spot on when it comes to aiming. That's kind of the trend is, I think a lot of KT Rolster fans have said that I'm low on a lot of their players for quite a few years, but aiming has been someone that I think I've been right on the money for quite a long time. We know exactly what he's really good at, which is scaling into the late game. If he can survive the early game, if you can give him a lead, he's going to team fight incredibly well, but the early game consistency from him is always going to be at least a little bit of an issue, and that was the case again in spring. Now, as good as this team was, there were moments where aiming and Lehens just did not have any sort of pressure in the early 2v2, and that was definitely their weakness when it came to kind of early games and being able to be exploited by the best teams in the league. But aiming's still a really good player, and honestly, he's an asset to this team. Like, you're winning because of him. You're not winning in spite of him. He's not a weak link or anything like that. I just don't think that his style necessarily is perfect. The way he ends up playing the game isn't necessarily perfect, but he's about as good at that style as you can possibly be. And then you've got a player like Lehens in the support position. He comes in at number 3. That's actually down from number 2 at the start of the year, but that should not be any sort of indication that he was not good in spring. He was incredibly good in spring. I just think Kellen absolutely deserved to move up. Lehens is still fantastic, incredibly aggressive as a player, somebody who is going to look to make moves in the early game, look to take risks that can sometimes be at odds with aiming. We saw this bot lane get into positions where they were behind in gold a little bit because it felt like, especially early on in the split, they weren't always on the same page, but as the split went on, it definitely got better, and I think that, you know, maybe add another split of these two playing together, maybe they can figure out a style that ends up working for both of them. But Lehens individually is such a talented player, and he won a lot of games for KT Rolster last split. Aiming was really good as that late game insurance policy, and then BDD, Keen, like they're MVP candidates cause more than serviceable as a top-level jungler. This team is just incredibly well-rounded, and again, I think in terms of what they showed off in spring, I feel more confident about their ability to put it together as a team, as opposed to a team like Dplus KIA, who I do have listed just below. Of course, they're in the same tier. If KT Rolster were to fall down to number 4, or, you know, God forbid, hell, even number 5, which I do think is technically possible, I wouldn't be the most shocked in the entire world, but this is also the kind of team where if they just continue to build a synergy, if Keen has another one of those monster seasons, if BDD is an MVP, and if Aiming and Lehens get it together, like, they could be a finals team. Like, it really isn't out of the realm of possibility for them to be one of the 2 best teams in the region. And so, KT Rolster fans, I hope you're happy and excited for this ranking. I know you've been frustrated with me in the past in these videos for ranking this team too low, but they now come in the highest they ever have in one of these preseason predictions at number 3 in my power rankings. And that's going to bring us to our final 2 teams here in the LCK pre-season power rankings and primer video. Really do appreciate you guys sticking around to this point, but you know who the top 2 teams are. We knew probably going into the video who I was going to rank as the top 2 teams here in this region, and it's not going to really be a surprise, but maybe the order will. It's always contentious to see which way I go on these 2 teams, but for now, coming in at number 2 in my power rankings and starting off the S tier, which, you know, if A tier are Worlds caliber teams that, you know, will be going to Worlds and will likely make it out of groups, these are the teams that can win Worlds. These are the teams that are not looking to get to Worlds, they're looking to win Worlds. These 2 teams are both under that mindset now, and starting us off at number 2 and at the bottom of S tier for me, it is going to be Gen.G. They do come in at number 2, your LCK Spring Champions in 2023. Gen.G come in as the number 2 team in my power rankings, and this is just where I feel comfortable placing them, especially after MSI, but even before MSI. This is probably where I would have placed them, and people who watched my MSI coverage know that. They know I had more faith in the other team, the team that will be in number 1 going into the tournament, and I thought that maybe the spring finals was like a little bit of an upset, if you will, and I definitely still stand towards that opinion. I think if you look top down, top to bottom, I just trust the other team a little bit more, so Gen.G comes in at number 2, but again, this is still the second best team in the LCK. This is a World Championship contender, someone who can legitimately win the tournament if everything were to go right, and so I don't want it to be, you know, me just comparing them to number 1. I want to talk about their strengths as well, but their roster in 2023 is looking like Doran in the top lane, Peanut in the jungle, Chovy in the mid lane, Pays at AD carry, and Delight at support. Just a lot of really, really talented and fun players to watch. We can go over them individually. We're going to start with Doran in the top lane, just the epitome and the pinnacle of stable top side of the map. it can carry games. Like, I don't want it to seem like he's some weak side only player. He's not a weak side only player. He's just an incredibly stable, really consistent top lane player who, if you give him like a champion that's really good in team fights, he's going to be able to team fight well. If you give him a duelist and ask him to try to win 1v1s, he's going to be up in CS. He's going to do whatever you ask of him. He's not going to do it at a superstar level because he still has his limitations, especially when going up against the best top laners in the world. But I think he's like the jack of all trades, not master of none, but like pretty damn close of all of them, right? Like, he's a really, really good player. I compare him a lot to Breathe over in the LPL. I think they're pretty similar. I think Doran might be a little bit better. He's certainly in better form at the current moment, but very similar in terms of just players that are good at almost anything you ask them to do. I think Doran will continue to be that. I don't really see any reason for him not to be that on this Gen.G team. And then you've got Peanut in the jungle. He drops down to number 2 in terms of my rankings. Kind of insane to say that, but he's still one of the best junglers in the entire world, and he has shown that super consistently, basically over the course of his entire career. He's never been anything less than that, really. He's dragged teams that have not been close to Worlds to the World Championships in the past, and he has such a connection with Chovy in the mid lane. I always talk about this. As good as Peanut and Chovy are as individuals, them playing together almost seems unfair because both of them play off of each other in such an incredible way, and it really makes Peanut even better. He is the best supportive jungler in the world. You can kind of compare him with Tarzan. I think that's a pretty fair, like, argument to be made, you know, which one do you like more, but I personally would take Peanut. I think his ability to set up the rest of his laners is just unparalleled, and I really don't think that there's anybody that I would rather have for this Gen.G team in particular than Peanut. I think he plays off of a lot of these more resource-heavy carries like Chovy and like Pays to the fullest extent, and I think it really helps out this team a lot. But then you get to Chovy in the mid lane. What do you want me to say about Chovy? That he's the most talented player in the world. Knight is the only player that I think has any sort of conversation with that. Maybe Ruler. Like, those are your 3, like, most talented individual mechanical players in the world, but Chovy's got a really good case to be number 1 in that debate. The dude is just never going to lose if something crazy doesn't happen. He just doesn't lose. It's actually insane. There are no off games for Chovy, and yes, he does still have problems, right? Like, I always talk about this. He still has the issue where sometimes if his team is behind, he can take it upon himself to feel like he has to carry the game, and he'll go and try and get as much CS as possible and try to accumulate as much gold as possible. And sometimes you don't need to do that. Sometimes you just need to be there for fights. And I think a lot of that is him feeling like he has to win the game 1v9 by himself. And especially on this team, he really does not have to do that. But he's gotten better at that. I think he's gotten better at realizing where he needs to be at what moments. And, you know, if you're talking about Chovy, like, in the right spot with the right items, like, it's over. There's no one who can compete with him in terms of mechanical talent. And so, yeah, Chovy's going to come in as my number 1 mid laner. The dude is going to be number 1 until somebody proves otherwise. He is the reason that this team ended up winning in spring. You know, we'll talk about Pays in a second. He had a great finals and a great playoffs, but the inconsistency with him is a little bit worrying. And then, you know, but Chovy doesn't have that. Chovy will be the best player in the LCK this split. If he's an MVP, I'm not going to be entirely surprised. And then you've got the bot lane, Pays and Delight. They're really solid. Now, a lot of people are going to be mad that they're both ranked at number 4. I've been really low on Delight in particular. People have been mad at me in the comment section about that all year long up to this point. I really do think he's more of a product of the system than he is like an elite level support, but he's still really damn good, and I hope this number 4 ranking is indicative of that. I mean, he comes in only behind the 3 best supports arguably in the world that aren't missing right now, and so, you know, not a bad ranking to be. Comes in ahead of a player that I really like in Kale, and so, you know, number 4 is certainly not a disrespectful ranking, but I think people are going to see Pays at number 4 and really be mad about that one, but I just don't know if I can put him ahead of players like Deft at the current moment, if only because he still is a little bit one-tricky in terms of the play style. Again, not in terms of the champion, but he very much is a late-game team fighter. He is aiming, but, like, cranked up. He's more mechanically talented than aiming. It's why he comes in above him in the rankings, but I still think that there are teams that are going to be able to take advantage of his playstyle. We honestly saw that at MSI, where he wasn't particularly great in laning phase, especially against Billy Gaming, a team that was going to push that tempo early. And so, you know, I like Pays, but he definitely still has his weaknesses, but he's 17, dude. Like, if he's number 1 by the end of the split, I'm not going to be surprised. As negatively as I'm talking about him at the current moment, the dude's played, what, like 43 games in the LCK? You know, you give him, you know, 20, 25 more, like, yeah, he could be number 1 by the end of the split. He's got the talent to do so. He's still crazy young. He's got the team that is going to propel him forward. I don't want it to come across like I'm low on Pays, and I certainly don't want it to seem like I'm not cheering for his success. I want to give a lot of credit to the players that have done it for longer in terms of my player rankings. But again, if he ends up shooting up this list, like skyrocketing to number 1, I'm going to be not surprised at all. And again, Delight's going to look good in this system. He plays well off of everybody on this team, especially Peanut. Him and Delight have very good chemistry together, and so really good to see that. But I think if you took him off of this team, things would be a little bit different, but that's just my personal opinion. It's not really going to affect his performance here in 2023. But overall for Gen.G, I mean, this is a world-class team. Again, if everything clicks for this team, if Pays becomes the number 1 bot laner in the world, if Peanut continues to play well, like Chovy, Chovy is Chovy, if all of that happens, like, they could win Worlds. It's not out of the realm of possibility at all for this team to be in that contention. They could absolutely still make the LCK finals. They could win the LCK finals again, right? Like, that wouldn't even be out of the realm of possibility either. I just think for now, they're going to come in at number 2 for me because I just have slightly more questions about them than I do about the team at number 1. But I hope you guys don't see that as a slight towards them, because when you look at them in isolation, they are about as good of an LCK team as you can get. And that's going to bring us to our final team of the video, number 1 in my power rankings, and the team that I expect to be hoisting the LCK trophy here at the end of summer. And surprise to maybe not a lot of people here, my number 1 team, and coming in at the top of S tier, a true favorite to end up winning the World Championships despite what ended up happening at MSI, I've got T1. It's just really hard to bet against them, if I'm being entirely honest. Look at this roster. I have so much faith in all of these players individually, especially domestically, that it's really hard for me to go a different direction. This was easily the best team for a majority of spring. They just got upset in the spring finals, and that happens. It's one day, and I talked about this, at MSI. No flame to Gen.G. I don't mean that as like Gen.G is a bad team. They didn't deserve to win. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, though, that if those two teams played 10 best of 5s, I would expect T1 to probably win about 7 of them, right? That's still Gen.G winning 3, and that's still a realistic possibility, but I would expect T1 to be the better team in most of those situations, and we kind of saw that at MSI, where T1 were able to take down Gen.G and go a little bit further into the tournament, actually putting up a fight against JD Gaming as well. So let's go ahead and look at their roster that ended up getting there. They've got Zeus in the top lane, Owner in the jungle, Faker in the mid lane, Gumayushi at AD carry, and KIA at support. Really no weaknesses. Again, even all the other teams that we've talked about has something that I guess could go wrong for them. Maybe one position where they don't have a superstar, just kind of a good player. For Gen.G, I think you could say top lane is a little bit like that, but, Pays and Delight still have a lot to prove, at least in terms of consistency. Delight in particular in my mind. And then for KT Rolster, you've got a player like Aiming that I don't think is necessarily like a super duper star, like a top 4 to 5 player in his role in the world. For a team like Dplus KIA, you've got Kana, you've got Canyon that's got to get back on track. Like, there are question marks. I just don't really have that for T1, especially domestically. All of these players are good enough to be the single best player in their role in the region, which is why I voted them all first team All-Pro at the end of spring, because all of them were the best players in their position in their region. And so let's go ahead and talk about it, starting with Zeus in the top lane. I know he gets a lot of flack because his international performances haven't exactly lived up to expectation, but when you're talking about regular seasons, when you're talking about LCK playoffs, domestic performances, he's still the GOAT. He's still the best top laner in the region, and it's really not hard to see why. He never loses lane. He's never behind. He can carry games if you give him an inch of room, and really that's the most scary part when it comes to T1, because we'll get to the rest of this team. Owner, obviously known for winning. Faker, known for winning. Guma and KIA, one of the scariest lanes to go into, especially with their unpredictability. But when you have to deal with all of that, and then also Zeus in the top lane, like, it just makes it impossible to actually find a way to beat this team in the early game. They go into the mid game with such crazy leads that they are just able to slowly strangle out of their opponent, that there's really not a lot of ways for teams to end up beating them. Really, they end up beating themselves most of the time. And Zeus is a great byproduct of that. Crazy good mechanically. A really, really good top laner. Better on duelists. Definitely somebody who likes to play the more aggressive role. But what has really impressed me is his ability to adapt to tanks in the past year or so. It was something that he was okay at last year when he really got his first full-time action in the LCK. But, in spring, he was really good on tanks. And it was something that they were going to a lot more consistently. I expect to see that continue to go up. If he's good at every top lane champion, it's just unfair to have to play into him at that point. And then you've got Owner in the jungle. Still fantastic. #1 jungler in the league. He honestly gets underrated at bits, even by me. I didn't necessarily rate him as, or talk about him as much as I should have across Spring Split. I kind of just knew that he was the best jungler. I never really brought it up on camera, and I probably should have brought it up on the channel because the dude is absolutely ridiculous when it comes to his mechanical skill and his ability to just, like, absolutely destroy the enemy jungler. He never really lost in Spring. Like, it was actually astounding. Even in the games where they got behind, like, there were very few games where it felt like Owner was not playing at a super high level, and that was even the case internationally. It never really felt like his fault that his team was behind. He was still active, he was still making plays. Sometimes he can be a little bit too dependent on his laners, but I honestly think that's more of a playstyle decision rather than a fault in Owner as a player. I think if you were to put him on a worse team with worse laners, I think he'd be even more aggressive, somebody who wouldn't wait as much for the rest of his team. But because he's on a team with such great players, he feels like he needs to play to them sometimes. And so I'm not worried about Owner. The dude is absolutely ridiculous mechanically as a player. And then you've got Faker in the mid lane. The dude just had maybe the best split of his entire career, and he's the GOAT. He's the greatest of all time. And he maybe just had the best split of his entire career. What is going on? What are they feeding people at T1? He was absurdly good over the course of Spring. We had been talking about this narrative that he had been on the downward trajectory over the past few years, and it honestly felt like that was the case. Not necessarily because he was worse, but rather because it felt like his role had kind of transitioned. He was more of the scaler. He was someone who was going to help the rest of his team a little bit more, play more for jungle, play more for bot lane, etc., that kind of stuff. But that meta completely flipped on its head in Spring, which is insane because it was a bot-focused meta, and that was the meta they decided, okay, no, actually, we're just going to play all-around Faker. We're going to give him hyper carries, and he's going to win us the game by dominating lane phase, and that's exactly what happened in a lot of different games that T1 played over the course of last split. And so, yeah, Faker's pretty damn good. He goes all the way up to #2. He's only behind Chovy, and even then, it's not by a lot in terms of my player rankings. Then you've got Guma and Keria. What can I say? Guma honestly gets underrated because he's not the shining star in terms of resources when it comes to this team. He took a backseat for them in Spring, and a lot of people thought, me included, that he was probably the only player that you could realistically not put in the first team All-Pro, but even then, you could make an argument that no AD carry in the league played their role better than Gumayushi, who knew he wasn't going to have resources, knew that he was the second most important person in his bot lane, and played accordingly, played more supportive, but was really good in team fights still. And so, overall, still love Guma. We see what can happen when you give him those resources. He was great in the LCK playoffs, and he was this team's best player at MSI, not at Worlds. He was at Worlds as well last year, but at MSI especially as well. And so I don't worry about Guma. If he is asked to be the main carry of this team, we know he can step up and be that. Realistically, you could probably put him as the #1 AD carry, and I don't think that would be all that far out, but he comes in at #2 for me. And then Keria, the MVP of Spring Split, and it wasn't close. He was the single best player in the LCK in Spring, and if he can keep that up even remotely over the course of summer, this team is going to be absolutely unbeatable in the regular season. Obviously, people are going to point to the crazy, crazy meta picks, the marksman in the bot lane, whatever, that crazy stuff that he was able to pull out all of Spring, but are we forgetting that when he did go to the Nami, when he did go to the Lulu, when he did go to the Nautilus, he was still the best at them of anybody in the league? Like, he's not a one-trick pony that needs crazy picks in order to succeed. He's just the best support in the world, and to me, it's not particularly close. I know people really like missing. I like Kellen and a lot of these other players, Lahen's got to be in that conversation, but Keria, to me, is far and away the best support in the world, and I think you can make an argument that he's the single best player in the world right now in League of Legends, which is just astounding, especially out of the support position. So he comes in at #1, but, I mean, really, what do you want me to say? This team is unbeatable when they are playing at their highest level, and that's going to continue. They can play for top lane and get Zeus ahead. They can play for jungle and get Owner ahead. They can play for mid lane and get Faker ahead. They can play for bot lane. Hell, support can do whatever you want. This team is so flexible. They are so talented. They have great macro. They are super clean. They don't really make mistakes in the mid to late game. I don't know what the weakness is for T1 over the course of an entire split. Now, obviously, a lot of this changes when you go up against the best teams in the world in a best of 5, as we saw at MSI, but I'm honestly willing to bet that's a little bit more of a roadblock than a full-on stopping point. I think that this team can only go up from that performance, and if we're talking about them as the winners of Worlds at the end of the year, I don't think anyone, including me, will be surprised even a little bit. All right, but that is going to do it for my 2023 Summer Split LCK Primer and Power Rankings video. I do hope you guys enjoyed. We put a ton of effort into these videos. Of course, watching all the tape from spring again as we go into this, next split, but also watching a lot of new tape from players that are entering the league. And so, if you guys do appreciate the content that we're putting out, feel free to hit a like on it. It really, really does mean a lot to the channel. Not only does it let me know you guys are enjoying the content, but it helps get this video out to a lot more people. Of course, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button. Not only are we going to be covering the LCK every single week, we're going to be doing weekly recaps of all 4 of the major regions as well as the NACL on this channel. So if you're interested in comprehensive LoL esports coverage, this channel is probably it for you. Of course, especially if you enjoyed this video, I would recommend you hit that subscribe button and hit that bell so you can get those weekly notifications. And then, of course, let me know down in the comment section below what you guys thought of the list. We're not going to agree on everything, and so if you've got disagreements, if you've got your own lists, I'd love to see them down in the comment section below as well. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day. And I will see you all later.